Behind every legend of a hero king charging into the fray is the silent, crushing weight of reality. For Alexander the Great, the true enemy was not the Persian Immortals or the war elephants of Porus, but the simple, unyielding math of human survival. An army of 65,000 men consumes approximately 12,000 tons of grain and over 15,000 tons of water every single day. To march this mass of humanity over 11,000 miles across the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush and the sun-bleached wastes of the Gedrosian Desert required more than just charisma. It required the most sophisticated logistical machine the ancient world had ever seen. The genius of Alexander lay not merely in how he fought, but in how he ensured his men were fed well enough to fight, transforming the very environment of Asia into a moving supply depot through a meticulous synchronization of geography, timing, and engineering. The foundation of mobility. The reforms of Philip II. The unparalleled speed and operational range of the Macedonian army were not spontaneous developments of Alexander's reign, but were the results of a radical military overhaul initiated by his father, Philip II. Before Philip, Greek warfare was characterized by short-duration campaigns between neighboring city-states. These armies were slow, burdened by massive baggage trains of ox carts and thousands of non-combatant followers, including slaves, merchants, and families, who often outnumbered the fighting force itself. Philip recognized that the traditional logistics system, designed for short distances and slow movement, was incapable of supporting a sustained conquest of the Persian Empire. Philip implemented a series of lightning reforms focused on sustainability, mobility, and speed. The primary innovation was the total ban on ox carts and wagons. Oxen were notoriously slow, moving at roughly 3.2 kilometers per hour, and could only work for 5 hours a day before requiring extensive rest and forage. Furthermore, the ancient throat and girth harness was inefficient. As the animals pulled against the weight of a heavy cart, the strap would press against their windpipes, essentially choking them if they exerted too much force. By eliminating wagons, Philip forced his soldiers to become self-sufficient. Every Macedonian phalangite was required to carry his own armor, personal possessions, and up to 30 days' worth of flour. This made the soldiers the primary pack mules of the army, a concept later echoed by the Roman general Marius. This reform allowed the army to move through rough terrain where carts would have been trapped, ensuring that the Macedonian force remained the fastest-moving military entity of its time. The physical requirement placed on the individual soldier was immense. The total weight carried by a phalangite often reached approximately 80 pounds. This weight included the massive sarissa, which Philip ingeniously designed to be detached into 2 sections to increase its portability during long marches. This modular design prevented the spear from becoming a snagging hazard in forested or mountainous regions and allowed the soldier to balance the weight more effectively across his shoulders. The ability to move an army 800 kilometers in just 13 days caught opponents off guard, as demonstrated during the lightning march from Lake Lynchytus to Boeotia. The mathematics of ancient supply, caloric and volumetric analysis. To understand the scale of Alexander's logistical challenge, one must analyze the daily requirements of a force of 65,000 personnel, 6,000 cavalry horses, and approximately 1,300 baggage animals. The primary limiting factor was not just the availability of food, but the carrying capacity of the animals used to transport it. A pack horse or mule can carry roughly around 100 kilograms, while a camel can manage up to 140 kilograms. However, these animals are biological machines that require their own fuel. A horse consumes about 5 kilograms of grain and 40 liters of water daily. This creates a logistical paradox. The more animals one adds to carry food for the men, the more food and water those animals consume. Eventually, reaching a point of diminishing returns where the animals are simply carrying their own sustenance. The mathematical threshold for a self-contained march is stark. If an army is forced to carry all its own water and grain for both men and beasts, the maximum duration it can travel before total resource depletion is remarkably short. Calculations suggest that the limit for a grain supply carried by humans is roughly 2 weeks, while a desert crossing without external resupply cannot exceed 4 days. This is because the volume of water required for 65,000 men and thousands of animals is so vast that the animals required to carry it would consume the water faster than it could be delivered to the front lines. The relationship between distance, time, and animal consumption can be expressed through a simple logistical decay formula, where the net delivery capacity of an animal decreases as the number of days increases. Where is the initial carrying capacity, and is the daily consumption rate of the animal? For a mule carrying 120 kilograms and consuming 9 kilograms of grain forage daily, the animal's utility reaches 0 in just 12.5 days if it is only carrying its own food. This total weight of nearly 550 tons per day demonstrates why constant movement and local foraging were absolute necessities. If the army stayed in one place too long, they would create a supply desert, depleting the local resources within a radius of 50 miles in a matter of days. Consequently, Alexander's strategy was never to carry everything from home, but to synchronize his movements with the environment. He used a rolling magazine system where the army moved from one predetermined supply point to another, often utilizing the existing agricultural infrastructure of the lands he conquered. Bematists, the human GPS and land surveyors. Precision in timing and distance was critical for Alexander's logistical planning. He could not afford to arrive at a river crossing or a city 2 days late if his rations were calculated to last exactly until that point. To solve this, Alexander employed a specialized unit known as Bematists or Bematiste. These were professional step counters trained to measure vast distances with a consistent, practiced pace. Bematists like Diognetus and Baton were essential to the military's intelligence, keeping track of the distance traveled by, counting their steps across varying and often brutal terrain. The work of these ancient surveyors was not merely for record-keeping but for active strategic modeling. They provided the data necessary to calculate the exact number of days a march would take and how much grain would be required for that specific leg of the journey. Modern scholars have compared the measurements recorded by Alexander's Bematists, preserved in the works of Pliny and Strabo, with modern geodetic calculations. The accuracy achieved without the aid of modern technology is staggering, suggesting the Bematists may have even used mechanical odometers, such as those later described by Heron of Alexandria, to cross-check their manual step counts. This data allowed Alexander to operate with a tiny margin for error. For instance, before embarking on a campaign, he would ensure that the rations carried by his men would last until they reached a location where a local harvest was scheduled to occur. By knowing the exact distance provided by Bematists and the exact rate of consumption calculated by his logisticians, Alexander could time his arrival at a target city precisely when its granaries were full. Leveraging the Persian infrastructure, the Royal Road. Alexander did not just conquer the Persian Empire, he inherited and optimized its existing administrative and logistical framework. The Achaemenid Empire was held together by the Royal Road, a network of highways stretching approximately 2,700 kilometers from Susa to Sardis. This infrastructure was characterized by a system of 111 way stations, or chapar khaneh, spaced roughly 15 to 20 kilometers apart. This distance corresponded to the maximum range a horse could travel at high speed before needing rest, allowing a courier relay system that could span the entire distance in just 9 days, a journey that took 90 days on foot. By seizing these hubs, Alexander gained control over the most advanced communication and transport system in the ancient world. These stations were not just for couriers. They functioned as fortified depots where grain, fodder, and fresh animals were stored. The buildings were often constructed from high-density cob bricks, which provided thermal insulation, keeping the horses and riders cool in summer and warm in winter. Alexander's logistical success was deeply rooted in his ability to integrate these Persian systems into his own operations. He often appointed his own governors to the satrapies he conquered, ensuring that the local tax and tribute systems continued to flow, with the grain being redirected to the Macedonian supply depots. Furthermore, the royal road served as a template for the expansion of his empire. As he moved further east into the Iranian plateau and Bactria, he established new Alexandrias at critical junctions, effectively extending the royal road's logic into uncharted territories. Environmental synchronization, the geography of hunger. A fundamental rule of Macedonian logistics was that the army's movements were dictated by the agricultural calendar rather than military preference. Alexander generally synchronized his campaigns with the local harvest cycles of the regions he was entering. In Mesopotamia and the Near East, this meant timing operations to coincide with the late spring and early summer when barley and wheat crops were ready for collection. The Mesopotamian agricultural and harvest cycle. The following table outlines the resource availability in the heart of the Achaemenid Empire, which Alexander exploited during his march from Issus to Gaugamela. By understanding these cycles, Alexander could plan his routes to ensure the army entered a region exactly when its food supplies were at their peak density. For example, in 334 BCE, Alexander carefully planned his crossing into Asia Minor to ensure that his initial 30 days of rations would last until 10 days after the local harvest date, providing a seamless transition from carried supplies to requisitioned ones. If a region lacked sufficient forage to support the entire army in one place, Alexander would split his forces, sending different columns through separate routes to prevent the exhaustion of local supplies. This split and converge tactic was a hallmark of his operational brilliance, allowing a massive force to move like a coordinated swarm through diverse terrains while avoiding the starvation that would plague a more concentrated force. The introduction of the camel and the ship of the desert. As the campaign pushed into the arid landscapes of Syria, Egypt, and eventually the Persian heartlands, the biological limitations of the horse and mule became apparent. These animals require massive amounts of water, often 30 to 40 liters daily, and are susceptible to heat exhaustion in sandy terrain. To solve this, Alexander incorporated the camel into his logistics system. Introduced into the Macedonian train in either Syria or Egypt and captured in massive numbers after the Battle of Issus from Darius III's baggage train, camels revolutionized the Macedonian supply chain. Their ability to carry 140 kilograms, 50% more than a horse or mule, while traversing sand and enduring extreme heat, made them the engine of the baggage train in the East. While they still required water to be efficient, their capacity to go for longer periods without drinking, and their ability to consume nearly any desert vegetation gave Alexander the strategic flexibility to cross deserts that had previously been deemed impenetrable barriers. Throughout the campaign, animals were attached to every deca's 10-man unit, ensuring that the supplies were distributed down to the tactical level. The human element, non-combatants, and the swelling train. While Philip II had strictly limited camp followers to maintain speed, the reality of a decade-long campaign forced Alexander to adapt his father's Macedonian way. As the army marched thousands of miles from home, the psychological toll on the men became a primary concern. To maintain morale, Alexander eventually permitted women and children to travel with the baggage train. This decision significantly changed the logistical profile of the army. What began as a lean, professional force gradually transformed into a moving, migratory city, This non-combatant collective, including families, physicians, bartenders, merchants, and even philosophers, often equaled or exceeded the number of soldiers. To manage this, Alexander appointed a skoidos, a transport officer responsible for the welfare of the baggage train, the distribution of supplies, and the defense of the vulnerable, non-combatant line. The presence of these followers meant more mouths to feed, but it also provided a secondary logistical labor force for tasks like grinding grain, making repairs, and managing the increasing number of pack animals. Medical logistics and the health of the army. The health of the army was a critical logistical concern, particularly given the various climates and diseases encountered in Asia. Alexander possessed a profound interest in medicine and healing, likely influenced by his tutor Aristotle. His army was accompanied by a cadre of professional physicians, such as Philip of Acarnania and Polydorus of Teos. While there was no formal medical corps in the modern sense, the presence of specialists who could treat battle wounds, identify edible plants, and manage outbreaks of disease was vital. Alexander himself was known to assist in the healing process of his men, a trait that reinforced his leadership through shared hardship. Archaeological evidence from Pella and other sites suggests that medical professionals were deeply integrated into the Macedonian court and military, ensuring that the king and his elite officers received the best possible care. Of particular logistical importance was the transport of medical supplies and the wounded. Despite his ban on wagons, Alexander retained a small number of carts specifically for this purpose and for the carriage of heavy siege machinery. Engineering the advance. River crossings and pontoons waterways were the most significant geographic obstacles in Asia. To maintain his rapid pace, Alexander had to cross massive rivers like the Hellespont, the Oxus, the Indus, and the Hydaspes. Unlike the Persians, who had used massive fleets to build permanent bridges across the Hellespont, Alexander often utilized more portable, improvised solutions that prioritized speed and surprise. In one instance, he crossed the Oxus, using rafts made from his soldiers' hide tents, stuffed with dry straw. This method allowed for a rapid crossing that bypassed the need for building materials in a region where timber was scarce. However, for more strategic crossings, he utilized the sophisticated engineering skills of his generals, most notably Hephaestion and Perdiccas. The bridge at Ohind, Indus River. In 327 BCE, Hephaestion and Perdiccas were sent ahead to bridge the Indus River near the town of Hund. The Indus at this point is approximately 400 to 500 meters wide, with a flow rate significantly faster than the Nile, fed by snow and glacial meltwater from the Himalayas. Hephaestion constructed a pontoon bridge of linked 30-oared galleys, a feat of engineering that required felling massive amounts of local timber. This bridge allowed the entire army, including its massive baggage train and cavalry, to cross into the Punjab region safely. The operation was so successful that King Taxiles, Ambi, was impressed enough to submit to Alexander, providing massive amounts of grain and silver to the Macedonian treasury. The naval connection. Maritime integration and Nearchus. Alexander's logistical system was not purely land-based. It was a multimodal operation that relied heavily on naval coordination, particularly during the later stages of the campaign. This was most evident during the 7-month siege of Tyre in 332 BCE. Because Tyre was an island city, it could only be reduced if Alexander could prevent it from being supplied by sea, while simultaneously ensuring his own army on the shore was sustained. Alexander's eventually superior fleet allowed him to establish a maritime supply line that bypassed the exhausted local land routes. As the army moved into the Indian subcontinent, Alexander ordered the construction of a fleet of 800 ships on the Indus, appointing his close friend Nearchus as admiral. This fleet was not merely a transport force, it was a strategic pivot intended to link the easternmost provinces of the empire with Mesopotamia through maritime trade routes. The fleet, carrying roughly 17,000 to 20,000 soldiers, sailed along the Makran coast, documenting geography, climate, and local populations. Intelligence that effectively created the first Greek maritime map of the East. The logistical plan for the return from India involved a high-stakes synchronization between Nearchus's fleet and Alexander's land army. Alexander marched inland to dig wells and establish grain depots along the coast to supply the fleet as it sailed toward the Persian Gulf. This interdependence was meant to ensure the survival of both forces, but it would eventually lead to one of history's greatest logistical disasters when the timing was disrupted by environmental factors beyond Alexander's control. The Great Logistical Failure, the Gedrosian Desert. The most harrowing episode of Alexander's career, and his greatest logistical blunder, was the march through the Gedrosian Desert in 325 BCE. Having reached the Hyphasis, Bias River, the army's morale finally broke, and they refused to proceed further into the Nanda Empire. Alexander decided to return west, splitting his forces, one group under Craterus taking a northern route through more hospitable terrain, and the main force led by Alexander through the coastal desert of modern-day southeastern Iran and southwestern Pakistan. Alexander's plan was for the land army to supply Nearchus's fleet as it made its way along the coast. However, the plan failed for several critical reasons. 1. Monsoon delay. The fleet under Nearchus was delayed by monsoon winds for months, breaking the synchronization with the land army. 2. Terrain and climate. The Gedrosian Desert proved far harsher than any previous desert encountered. Scorching temperatures caused severe dehydration, and blinding sandstorms frequently disrupted navigation. 3. Supply chain. Collapse. Because the fleet could not provide support, and the barren landscape provided little in the way of food or water, the army was forced to rely on dwindling supplies. 4. Biological toll. The uneven sandy soil caused pack animals to stumble and sink, draining their energy. Eventually, many animals had to be butchered for food. The results were devastating. Estimates suggest that up to 3/4 of the force, particularly the women, children, and baggage animals in the train, perished during the 60-day march. This failure underscores the core principle of ancient logistics. Without a reliable source of water and grain, even the most disciplined army will wither as surely as if it had been defeated in battle. Conclusion. Alexander as the first master of the supply chain. While history remembers Alexander for his tactical genius at Gaugamela or his bravery at the Hydaspes, his true greatness may lie in his role as the world's first global supply chain manager. He understood that an army's ability to project power was strictly limited by its stomach. By reforming the baggage train to prioritize speed, utilizing Bematists for precise data collection, synchronizing his movements with regional harvest calendars, and integrating naval and land logistics, he expanded the operational reach of the Macedonian state to a scale previously thought impossible. Alexander's success was not an accident of fate, but the result of proactive preparation and a mathematical approach to warfare. He transformed logistics from a secondary concern into a primary competitive advantage, allowing him to perform lightning strikes that caught his enemies completely off guard. Even his failure in the Gedrosian Desert serves as a scientific validation of his system. When the logistical pillars of synchronization and resource availability were removed, the army collapsed. Ultimately, Alexander proved that while a general might win a battle with courage, a king wins an empire with bread. This legacy would go on to inspire the military organizations of Rome, the Mongols, and Napoleon, establishing the fundamental principles of modern military science. If you like content like this, hit that subscribe channel to get notified when we post new videos.